Okay. So I see people joining now. So I'd like to begin by welcoming everybody here today. It's just, I believe, 2 minutes past the hour, wherever you are in the world. And our session is being recorded and everybody will be sent a link to the recording after the session. If you've got any questions and answers, please pop them in the Q&A, and together with Ken and Beth, we will get to work through as many questions as we can. In terms of our talk this evening, I'm delighted that we are joined actually by Dr. Magda Mostafa. Dr. Mostafa is an architect, a scholar, and an educator focusing on autism and inclusive design, currently leading autism design at Progressive Architects and teaching as Associate Professor of Design at the American University in Cairo. She is the author of Autism Aspects Design Guidelines, the world's first research-based design framework for autism worldwide. Aspects has been presented globally and was awarded the UIA International Research Award in 2014 and was the subject of her well-received TED Talk in 2015. Through various consultancies, Aspects has been used across 5 continents. Information about Dr. Mostafa's work can be found at her website. She recently developed the world's first autism-friendly university design guide at Dublin City University, and the published guide can be found at a link which we will provide you at the end of the session. And her work was also presented at the 2021 Venice Architectural Biennial. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Mostafa, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. I believe we're on the same time zone as you were saying a little earlier here in Ireland and Cairo, which I didn't know. So that's nice. And thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Professor Frawley. I'm delighted to be here. As I was telling you earlier, I've done a lot of work recently with Ireland and various partners in Ireland. And I think as a country, there's a lot of advocacy and progress on the issue of autism and neurodiversity and inclusion in different built environments compared to the rest of the world. So you really should congratulate yourselves with where you're at in this level of awareness. I know there's still a lot to do, but Ireland is really at the forefront of these types of conversations. So again, I know that we have a very diverse audience today. So I am an architect, and I want to talk to you today about a concept I've been developing recently that I call spectrum space, which is about thinking about space from a certain perspective that maybe challenges the way typically designers, architects, different individuals engaged in the built environment think about user groups. So this diagram is a very famous diagram in the design world by Swiss architect Le Corbusier. It's what we call the modular, which is the standard dimensioning and design standards that our entire modern world is built around. And my critique of this model is that it assumes a certain gender, so it's based on the male form. It assumes a certain ability, so it's based on a mobile ambulatory form. And certain sensory capabilities that this individual, that these design standards are built around, is seeing, hearing, moving, male, white. So it defines what we call quote unquote normal and bases a whole almost century of design standards and best practices on that model. And all of us know that the reality of our world is very, very different. Our world is actually very diverse. we have different bodies, different forms that engage with the built environment in very different ways. And as a designer, there's a lot of conversation now around terminology, and I think words are very important when we're thinking about our responsibilities towards disabilities. So the typical word used is inclusion. The problem with inclusion is that it assumes a certain norm that a group that is outside of that norm is being invited into. So it reinforces this idea of us and them, this idea of inclusion and exclusion. So recently there's been other terminology that is part of our architectural world called availability. And I find this term more comfortable when I'm talking about the kind of philosophy that I would like, the shift that I would like to see in the philosophy around design, that our built worlds, our learning spaces, our schools, our cities, our parks, our hospitals should be made available to different bodies, different forms, different abilities, different genders, different sensory profiles of seeing that world. And we need to design in as equal a way as possible for those different perspectives. And that's where we've been playing with and emerging this idea of availability. And at the heart of this philosophy is what I call autism-centered design. And it's bringing the autistic perspective to the forefront of the design process. And I'll just talk you through very quickly, historically, where this idea has emerged from. So many of you may be familiar with disability theory and how it's evolved, particularly over this past century. Began with a very medicalized model where the individual is seen as the pathology or the disease, and there needs to be a cure, again, to bring them into the quote unquote normative. And that evolved later in the mid 20th century around the functional model that was about rehabilitation, that was about support, but it was also about cure in a very functional way to bring people with their abilities up to the quote unquote standard of being in the world. More recently, with the social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s, post-World War II, emerged the social model, which posed that maybe the society is the problem, and the society and its environment didn't take everyone's needs into consideration. And you start seeing things like the UN's Commission on the Rights for Disabilities. You see things like the Americans for Disabilities Act, the International Building Code, that talks about our responsibility to alter the environment so that it is more accessible for society as a whole. Most recently, Damien Milton in the autism world has posed this idea of the autistic as expert, and that the ability or disability can be seen itself as an expertise that can be learned from, and that perceptual models like autism should be seen as a pathology, but should be seen as a different but equally valid way of perceiving the world. And a lot of our work is about expanding that conversation beyond just how the autistic individual can inform space and shape and place for themselves and for the places where they occupy, but how designing in that way is actually beneficial for everyone. Designing with that kind of broadened sensory profile of hypersensitivity and sensitivity to the sensory environment can actually be helpful for every user of our space and our cities. And I won't go through this entire graphic, but a lot of our work is also talking about intersectionality, how one person is never one thing, and that autism intersects with issues of gender, issues of race, issues of age, and that we need to go beyond just thinking of needs in this siloed, insulated way and start thinking more intersectionally across these different barriers and how autism presents different challenges for autistic women, autistic men, the different spectrum of gender and how it relates to autism and aging, for example, and so on and so forth. So I think the level of intersectionality is really important. Professor Frawley kindly outlined in my introduction the Autism Aspects Design Index and presented its history. It is a framework of how we think about space to take this perspective into consideration. It's now being used in many places all over the world. It's informing a lot of scholarship and practice and building design of my own and of partners that I've partnered with in many projects all over the world. This is actually a snapshot from the Dublin City University project, and we've been able and had the kind opportunity to share it and share its philosophy in a lot of different educational venues and professional venues in the United Nations and other places like the National Autistic Society and in the United States with different foundations. So we have had the opportunity to discuss what it means to think about autism-friendly design from a lot of different perspectives, and we're continually evolving how we approach it. One of the tools that we've created was a recent audit, and we are also looking at how these guidelines, these 7 frameworks and principles, are starting to align with other design guidelines, like, for example, deaf space or other research, and looking at just where that fits in the literature. But just to explain what we mean by the autism aspects framework very briefly, there are 2 versions of the aspects framework. The first version, the 1.0, was the one that was first published in 2014. It's comprised of 7 principles. The first of those principles is acoustics. And these frameworking criteria are not prescriptive. They won't say you need to design to a certain acoustical decibel range, or you need to use this kind of acoustical paneling or soundproofing, but they do point attention to the gradient of ways you need to work along the acoustical environment and how that can be in support of autistic users and autistic needs within your spaces. And I can talk a little bit more about that maybe in the questions. The next principle of aspects is spatial sequencing, and that builds on the affinity of the autistic mind to routine and order and predictability. It calls for all of us as designers to be able to look at space as an experience of a sequence of spaces and design in a way that's more seamless and predictable to hopefully reduce the stressors and anxieties of being in space that are so common for people on the spectrum. The third principle is escape, and it's about creating an infrastructure of places and spaces that autistic individuals and any individual can really retreat to in moments of sensory overload. And this is really important in places like educational spaces, campuses, cities, transportation infrastructure. I was just in a lecture earlier today about healthcare environments that I'll talk about in a moment. But escape spaces and the escape scape or the escape network and landscape is something that can be incredibly powerful in giving access to individuals on the spectrum to space. The next criteria is compartmentalization, and it's really about organizing our spatial experiences into manageable pieces. One of the biggest challenges, if you think of autism from the sensory perception model, which is one of the models that we can use to define and describe and understand the autistic experience, a lot of our challenge in the built environment is about unnecessary sensory input. We are constantly expecting people to engage with sensory information that is unnecessary for their task. And that can be overwhelming. I think it almost borders on a level of abuse and disrespect because we're putting sensory overload into our environments, particularly when you're talking about critical spaces like school environments or hospital environments, where functionality is so key to your success. When you put too much sensory input that is unnecessary to successful functioning into this space, you're disabling the autistic mind that is trying to operate within it. So compartmentalization is about only allowing that sensory input that is necessary for task. And it can be applied, I have a diagram here that looks at the city environment, but it can be applied to classrooms, it can be applied to residential spaces, and it's about cutting space up and reducing the sensory environment to only what is absolutely necessary. And of course, like all of these principles, there are different gradients to it. There are different ways to implement it that I can talk about later. The fifth concept is transition. And transition is really key because, again, we expect individuals to be able to seamlessly move from one experience to the next with no opportunity for adjustment. And that can be a huge challenge for the autistic perspective. So creating transition spaces allows and respects and validates the need to adjust your sensory makeup and to modulate and regulate your sensory experience to prepare yourself for the next task. So some examples are, you're at university, you're taking the bus on a crowded street, you arrive to campus, and within the first 10 minutes, you have to find your class, get in your seat, and immediately focus on a very complex series of information in a social environment that you're not particularly comfortable with, in a hall that may be echoey and noisy, and you're expected to make that transition immediately. And when you don't, people say you're a slow learner. But if you give that transition opportunity, and there is a space that is secluded and secured and quiet and safe for an individual to take a few moments to regulate and adjust, that prepares them and sets them up better for success. And you take someone who is slow to learn and possibly give them the opportunity to be able to get on task and focus because you've cleared out that sensory noise from their world. Again, thinking about our environment and sensory pieces, I know there may be some administrators or decision makers in our participants that think about how they organize their buildings or manage their spaces. And typically we think of functionality. So we put offices next to offices, classrooms next to classrooms, patient rooms next to patient rooms, nurses stations next to nurses stations, and so on. So we think purely from the lens of utility. But when you're designing for the autistic experience, you also need to overlay that with the lens of the sensory environment. So again, just this morning, I'm redesigning a new autism center, and we're looking at the vocational training spaces that have heavy equipment that could be noisy and loud and vibrating. And then we have occupational therapy spaces that are about mock apartments and life skills. So one is very noisy and busy and about physical movement, and one is a quieter, more focused space. And although as a program, they're all seen as life skills or vocational training or adult support, they are, from the sensory perspective, very, very different qualities of space. And you need to design with that understanding so that everything is seamless. And then, of course, safety is always an issue that we need to think about when we're designing, not only for the autistic perspective, but for everyone. And with the DCU Dublin City University project, we had the opportunity with their amazing students and their amazing autism-friendly university team and different groups like As I Am, which is Ireland's incredible autism support or autism advocacy group led by the brilliant Adam Harris, and other groups that joined us to bring their autistic perspective to this process of designing this autism-friendly university. We had the opportunity to do a second version of aspects that we're calling Aspects 2.0. And in it, we outlined different color schemes that were found to be successful, different lighting strategies, different materials and furniture layouts and setups and typologies that were useful, different strategies for wayfinding and navigation around either campus or in certain spaces. And also with Smart DCU's team, we built out a lot of thinking around how technology and smart systems can be used for support of autistic users. And again, that's something maybe I can touch on a little bit more in our discussion, and issues of sensory economics and programming. I want to get into some examples because I think looking at autism and aspects from an abstract view is one thing, but seeing how it can be brought to a space and a place to redesign it is another. So this is an image of some work of a residential college in an Ivy League university in the United States that I am consulting on with a group of brilliant colleagues at Mixed Design, where I'm a member of their design consultancy and think tank. And this proposal is what we call multisensory wayfinding. It takes a prototype that is available or a piece of architecture that is in every building. There are hallways and corridors in every building type. And if you can understand how to design those spaces in a way that accommodate the needs not only of the autistic, but of the visually impaired, the hearing impaired, the mobility impaired, the different age groups that may engage with this space, the different gender identities that will be part of this college campus. If you can design in that way, then you can truly be inclusive in a way that's not only about installing a wheelchair ramp or doing Braille signage. So this multisensory wayfinding strategy is to do exactly that. It takes the different needs of the deaf, the blind, the autistic, the wheelchair user, and so on, and creates these microclimates that prioritize one of those needs at a time. So for example, the one in the center, this cone structure creates this acoustical little island in the middle for autistic users, but is also really helpful for people who are hard of hearing that need to filter out background noise, or for individuals who are focused on work or have a certain attention deficit that need to focus, that acoustical support. And case in point, we have an ambulance driving by as an example of acoustical noise and how useful it will be to filter some of that noise out. And there are other examples. So again, like a focused comm zone, similar to the escape spaces I showed you earlier, that not only can be used for autistic users, they can be used as quiet spaces for deaf signers to retreat to have a conversation, because their conversation is about facing one another and they can't necessarily do it while in motion in the circulation space. So it's about thinking intersectionally how the strategies that we develop for autism can actually benefit others and vice versa. So one of the partners that I work with on this project and that I work with in mixed design is Hansel Baumann, who's the author of the Deaf Space Guidelines, which is the counterpart of Aspects in the Deaf World. And it may be interesting for some of you to look at. I also want to go very quickly through a hospital project, a healthcare project, just because I know Professor Frawley himself and maybe others on the call may be interested in the healthcare space. So this is the University of Nebraska's Medical Center Monroe-Meyer Institute that I designed with Altus Studios. And looking at this diagram, one of my responsibilities was to look at the hospital environment in its entirety. Embedded within it was an early intervention autism center. And that's why I was brought on to consult, but I gradually spilled over my input to all the spaces of the hospital environment, because there could be graduate students who are on the spectrum. There could be physicians who are on the spectrum. There could be patients. If you're autistic, it doesn't mean you're not going to break your leg or need your appendix out or need your tooth fixed. So the idea of the autistic profile, we were able to have conversations where we see it as something that carried over the entire population of any space. And Altus is really a world leader in hospital design and did a fantastic job in thinking about coordinating aspects into the work that they presented. Again, the wayfinding strategy, the escape spaces along the corridors, transition spaces, use of signage, and so on. Another project that I was lucky enough to be invited to and involved in was by Abe Rogers, the brilliant Abe Rogers, who is a British architect and designer who has designed some of the most beautiful healthcare spaces, in particular one of the Maggie Center I think it was the Marsden Maggie Center that he designed. And he recently invited me to give my neurodiversity autism perspective to designing the hospital of the future as part of the UK's policy exchange Wolfson initiative for what the hospital of the future should look like. And Abe's brilliant strategy that you see in its final version here was all about human-centered design, bringing nature into the hospital, but also from the lens of autism and neurodiversity and many, many other lenses. This document is available in its entirety online if anyone wants to read it. It's open access, and it shows all sorts of lenses of what the hospital should look like. And we talked about different processes and the power of thinking about design. One of the things that we were very engaged in was how do we develop a participatory process that takes the needs of autistic individuals into consideration, how we can run workshops, because participatory workshops and participatory design has become something very common in school design, hospital design, all sorts of different strategies, but the tool itself is not necessarily set up for the autistic experience. So the picture you see on the top is a typical design thinking workshop, and you actually see a visually impaired individual who's on the spectrum as part of that group that is struggling to be part of that crowd and engage with the visual material. So we rethought that process, and as part of the Dublin City University guideline, there's a whole set on how you can think about these processes differently. I just want to close very, very briefly with something that I think is central to the next step in the future of thinking about autism-centered design. And these next 3 slides are all pieces of work that were included in our show at the Venice Architecture Biennale last summer. And in these 6 images, these are recreated photographs of a young autistic teen's coping mechanism of how he navigated the visually overstimulating world by viewing the world through its shadows and reflections as opposed to through its objects themselves. And he used these photographs to communicate in his nonverbal way to his teachers and parents that it wasn't that he wasn't interested or wasn't following what was happening when he didn't make eye contact, but it was because the visual environment was so overwhelming for him. He followed what was happening in its shadow and in its reflection rather than in the object itself. And if we hadn't looked at these photographs and this process from the lens of autism as expertise as opposed to autism as disability, we would have never discovered this coping mechanism. And this has helped inform how I think about the visual environment of architecture and minimizing the sensory overload. Another way that the autistic expertise has informed is something that I call the Melania Pathway. It's named after Melania Larson, who is one of the Dublin City University students who was absolutely central and instrumental in the Dublin City University Autism Friendly Design Project. She was navigating through campus by using the hidden quiet pathways in the backs and alleyways of buildings rather than walking along the central mall. And the reason she was doing it is that the mall was very overcrowded, it was noisy, it was smelly, it was overstimulating. So she had crafted this alternative pathway for herself. And we thought that to be such a brilliant strategy that we actually formalized it and proposed creating an entire full circuit of campus that's an alternative pathway that other individuals can use, and dotted along that pathway is a group of escape spaces and sensory retreats that people can engage in. And this final set of slides, just before I close and give an opportunity for questions, is by the brilliant autistic artist, researcher, who himself is Irish, Stuart Nielsen. And Stuart's work also, I was privileged and honored to have it represented as part of the collection in the Venice Biennale's work. And through his brilliant use of photography and computer programming to analyze the moving image, he is able to recreate experiences in the built environment to break them down in a way that he can understand the movement and the experience in a very distilled, compact way that helps him, again, filter out all that busyness. And this final video, also by the brilliant Stuart Nielsen, is a result of his time in lockdown from the window of his home, and the video analysis he did of some GoPro footage where he was analyzing the movement of the seagulls around the city. And he actually, through this analysis, discovered this pattern that the seagulls were following that mirrored the street network below, which was a really interesting observation. So these are just three very quick examples of how the autistic expertise can really inform how we think about the built environment. And these are some of the resources that I mentioned and that Professor Frawley also mentioned. I'm happy to share them with Beth and the rest of the organizing team if they would like to share them with the audience. These are all QR codes. You can also scan them. But I will make sure that the links are made available for everyone. And I hope I haven't used up too much time. I think I went a little bit over, I apologize. But thank you very much.
No, not at all. That was such an incredibly interesting presentation. In fact, I think it's one of the best presentations I've seen in architecture, and I've actually seen a number over the last 4 to 5 years. And so many areas are popping out for me. I'm glad you mentioned hospitals, because I know we're here to talk about autism and architecture, but I really am keen to see that our acute mental health units, the architecture of our acute mental health units, I feel we need to do more to make them spaces which are genuinely therapeutic, where the milieu is healing. And of course, this relates to autistic people and people who aren't autistic, and it's that universal design excuse me, that we need to look at. Just if I could ask a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. I really liked when you spoke about the design of premises. I'm wondering though a little bit about the retrofit of our existing premises. It could be our university campus or elsewhere. how can we retrofit or redesign our existing buildings and premises to make them more accessible?
Well, retrofit is probably the task I'm asked to do the most, because very rarely do you really have the opportunity in the budget to start something from scratch. It's not a common privilege people are given. And also, just from the sustainability perspective, we need to work with what we have. We have so much built environment that we need to make use of. So there are a lot of things that you can do, and I'll give you a few examples. I think the first thing that's really important is to do a sensory assessment of space and to find out where the red flags, where the critical issues are. And in my experience, a lot of times they are easy fixes, and a lot of times they revolve around acoustical environments. And I'll give you an example. I recently did a retrofit of a K-12 charter school in the United States that is a public school for autistic students only. But interestingly enough, the acoustical complaint about this space that we redesigned came from the staff, not from the students' observation. So it's what we call the vortex. It was not, of course, a vortex, but we called it the vortex. You'd walk into the school and there was this beautiful double height space with a pyramid shaped skylight that was made out of glass. And it was full of, this was in Florida, so it was full of lots of sunshine. And visually, if you were to look at an architectural diagram, you'd say this is a beautiful space. But when you enter it physically, it echoes, and it's at the nexus, the intersection of the main entrance of the school and two of the main school hallways where children are walking back and forth, and we all know how noisy school hallways can be. And all of this converged in this echo chamber, and there was noise just bouncing off the glass and bouncing off the wall, and you walked in and it was just so overwhelming. And that was the starting point of every student's day. So it was almost as if you were giving them a sensory overload the moment they set foot on campus. So it was the first thing that the client said, we need to do something about this. We did simple baffling with some fabric installations in the roof that brought the roof down, that softened and compartmentalized that large space, reduced the echo. We also installed very easy, very simple paneling on the corridor walls that introduced color, which was one of the recommendations because the school was symmetrical. So as you walked through, you could get confused on which wing you were at. So using color coding helped with wayfinding and navigation. And then the material itself was soundproofing and could be like a pin board, so they could put announcements and students' artwork, and it was more personalized. So that's one example. Another example is installation of different escape space and transitions, and those don't have to necessarily be constructed. So in a hospital environment, you can create, there are these beautiful freestanding, they're designed for conferencing, for open office plans, so that people can have a quiet environment to have a small meeting in like a big conference center. But they work beautifully for autistic needs because they create this little island of quiet with a little bit of soft seating, and they're pieces of furniture, so you just can plug them in anywhere. And they are exceptionally successful. Children in school environments use them for transition, for de-escalation and escape. They even use them for positive reinforcement and reward. So they ask for time, we call them the purple pods. They ask for time in the purple pods as a reward for tasks that they achieve in class. So there's so many things you can do. And the impact is tremendous on just small little changes. You don't have to demolish everything. You don't have to build a new space. There are many, many layers of intervention that you can do before you have to build a new space.
That's really great to hear, actually, Magda, because I was going to ask you about the Acoustic Islands, but I feel you may have addressed that question. A family member of mine, their biggest challenge is acoustics. They're a young autistic person, and it's the acoustics which really get them, and they really need to get to that escape space, actually. So it's really good to hear that there are these solutions which, you know, sound so tangible. Just in terms of one final question from myself, and then maybe Beth and Ken can come in with some of the Q&A from our viewers. I'm just wondering about academic conferences and festivals. If you've any maybe comment on those.
You mean as a environment themselves?
Oh yes, yes. Well, it just happens that I'm organizing one in July, and I'm keen that we you know, ensure that it's as accessible as it can be. And I mean, what we're doing is we will be having a series of rooms all around the premises. We're going to look at every single event and see if there is extraneous input, be it visual, auditory, whatever that might be. We're going to be looking as well at having volunteers. You know, we're going to look at wayfinding.
Right.
And these are just some, we have a number of people working on this, but I'm just wondering if you might have any other hints or tips for people organizing, I guess, events. It doesn't have to be, yeah.
Yeah, I do, but I want to just follow up on your point about the acoustical islands in a moment. I think
yes.
the solutions are easy, but the awareness of their urgency is hard. I think it's very difficult. I think part of our responsibility as a community is to communicate to decision makers that making an acoustical island available to a student or a patient or an employee is just as important as making a ramp available to a wheelchair user. And you have just as much responsibility to make that available as you would for a wheelchair user. The fact that it isn't code and necessarily legally required by code, so you can build and get a building permit of a building without an escape space, without an acoustical island, but you can't without a ramp. So I understand, but as one American colleague tells me, code compliance is really only as bad as your building is legally allowed to be. And we can elevate beyond that. So I think part of our responsibility is to communicate how important it is and how urgent it is that these spaces be made available and that they are tools of accessibility. They are not luxuries. They are not perks. They are not additional. And I think there's so much of a return on their investment that whatever money you spent there comes back into productivity and comfort and happiness and health. So to your question about conferences and conventions, I am going to blatantly plagiarize the work of As I Am. Because As I Am, I think, ran a conference that I attended just months before the lockdown that was so beautifully organized from the physical spatial planning standpoint. They did the best that I've seen in conference planning, and a few of the strategies that they did, and I'm sure they would be happy to, I'm sure they have these guidance points written down somewhere. They're just that effective and wonderful. But one of the things was to create quiet spaces and sensory rooms. The other thing was to make a video available of a walkthrough of the physical spaces for all attendees prior to the event. So you could watch a video and see what it was like to park your car, go through the entrance of the hotel, walk through reception, get to the conference main hall, and so on and so forth. There are certain things, of course, that you can't change. There will probably be some crazy carpet on the floor in one of the conference halls that's very visually overwhelming, and there's not much you can do about that. But you can schedule things in a way that's mindful, that you select smaller rooms as opposed to bigger rooms that have a lot of echo and that are unnecessary. You, in the planning, you create a lot of breaks and you make it clear that people can leave and come back to the room without feeling the stigma of them interrupting the speaker. So organize the seating and the arrangement in a way that it's easy and you don't feel like you're interrupting. If you need to step out for a moment, come back in. Weather permitting, I don't know what season of the year it's going to be, but weather permitting, allowing, scheduling it or organizing a place where there's outdoor space, because the natural environment is just a beautiful sensory regulator for people to be allowed to go outside. Another thing that they did at this conference is they had two meal halls, separate ones, a quiet one where people were not allowed to have loud conversations basically, and had to whisper, and a typical meal space. And they prioritized the quiet space to those who were comfortable with disclosing their autism diagnosis. Another thing they did is they had those stickers that you could put on that would say whether you were open to social interaction or whether you would prefer not to be approached for social interaction. There were just so many wonderful things that they did at that conference. And again, to the point I made earlier about these strategies being beneficial to everyone, that was, although I was giving a keynote, running a workshop, I had flown miles and miles, I wasn't feeling very well. It was the most comfortable conference I've ever been to because of this sensory respect that the whole environment gave to everyone, not necessarily someone who has an autism diagnosis or has that sensory need.
You make it sound, you know, almost blissful in the context of traveling and yeah, okay.
It was.
Sure. So just to bring in some of our audience and Beth and Ken, are there any questions you'd like to put to Magda?
Yeah, there's actually loads of questions there. And just in terms of Magda, obviously, just I have seen you talk before, and you know, and I'm very inspired by it. But one of the questions, you know, it came in there from Dan, and it reflects where I'm coming from. If I'm from ADHD Ireland, there was a couple of similar questions in the chat as well. And Dan was saying, fantastic and inspirational presentation. Thank you very much. How do we design environments to meet the whole diversity of sensory needs in our neurodiverse population? Is there a golden version of balance between stimulating and soothing environmental spaces?
I mean, that is such an excellent question, Dan, and it's something that we really grapple with. And as designers, particularly of places that are used by large groups of people like schools or hospitals that need to be that universally designed, that is the biggest challenge. However, there are some high-level concepts that I think can apply through to a large group of users. And the most important thing first is to borrow from the medical community and have the philosophy of first do no harm. So to make sure that any strategy you put in place for the use of one group is not disabling the needs of another group. And that's very important. So that it's not dangerous or unsafe to do something in the design for someone who's blind or deaf that then becomes a hazard for someone who's on the spectrum. The other thing is to allow for flexibility, for customizability, and for choice. So one of the things, and I'll try and give a concrete example for office spaces. So say you're designing a workplace environment for a neurodiverse population and a neurotypical population, and you want to make sure you're catering for everyone's needs. Perhaps you have different zones of sensory levels within either the open office space or within the allocation of your offices. So you have spaces that are single user, that are quiet, that are not distracting, that don't have glass walls where you see people walking back and forth all the time, that furniture configuration is comfortable, that has some acoustical treatment. But then you also have spaces that are more collaborative, allow for more movement, allow for more groups. And what's interesting is there's a lot of focus in the autism design world about sensory mitigation and taking the sensory out. But your point about sensory stimulation, that a lot of times there will be a need for sensory seeking. You want that stimulation. You need that you're hypostimulated and you need that stimulation. And it's impossible to do both. So you have to give the choice and the availability for as many of those opportunities as possible in a way that's managed and safe and that is zoned in a way that's sequenced logically, and that whenever overstimulation happens, you allow people to retreat and have that spatial opportunity to move out. The final thing I'll say about that, it's also about resolving those conflicts. So wherever I do a lot of work with my colleague on deaf space and on blind space, and because they're both coming from opposite sides of the spectrum of the sensory, from the vision and from hearing, and autism kind of sits in the middle, cross-cutting both. There's a lot of work that we've done on how do you resolve a space that could provide. So one calls for transparency, one calls for compartmentalization. How do you do both? So it's a really very important question. And my hope is that this type of awareness, that designers are actually aware that when they're designing, that person isn't necessarily seeing, hearing, neurotypical person. If we can just start there and people are aware that of the implications of the sensory environment, I think that will take us a long way. But it's an excellent, the short answer to that, Dan, is nobody knows exactly. There's no single answer. There's no single solution.
I know just Beth was coming to just part B to the same question. If you can pretend I'm some of these hard-boiled project managers and go, Magda, I've just heard what you said. I agree with everything you said. Can't afford it.
Right. So my response to you, and that is probably the second most common thing I hear from my clients, which is you have to think of the built environment through its entire lifespan when you think of cost. Don't think of just that moment to retrofit or renovate a single space. So yes, it will be more expensive to put in the acoustical treatment, to put in that dropped ceiling. That is more expensive because you're adding more detail. Number one, if you bake it into the design from the beginning, it isn't more expensive because you're planning for it and it's integrated. It's not something that you have to add on to fix a problem. But if you don't have the opportunity to start a project from scratch and you are retrofitting, look at the return on that investment. So for example, if I am a school who invests a lot of money on support teachers and para, I don't know what you call them in Ireland, but aides that would be in the classroom that come in and support students on the spectrum, pull out special treatments for if they do speech therapy or individual therapy, that they have to be shadowed maybe while they navigate around the school because the environment is so overwhelming. That is a cost to the school. If you design your spaces in a way that is set up that that child does not need that level of support and can be more independent. I always say we need to design with a dependence in mind, because when you're thinking about schools and hospitals, you really want the student, the user, to be as independent as possible because you cut down on those running expenses and running costs. I know as a facilities person, you say, well, that's an HR payroll thing. That's not my responsibility. And my response to that is, in the end, it still is one project. If I can design a classroom where a student is moving through the curriculum, some of the research we've done shows that students at their best can move through tasks 3 times faster when the classroom is designed with this sensory environment in mind. What does that mean cost-wise? Yes, that classroom is more expensive to build, but if that student is moving through the system 3 times faster, that teacher has 60% more time in her day and in her semester to give to other tasks that are costing the school money to pay someone a salary to do because she can't do them. That student is also moving through their grade levels faster. That patient is coming into the hospital and not having to be treated in a way that is time consuming because of their anxiety, because of their depression, because of their refusal to be examined, because they're overwhelmed by the environment, because they need to be managed. If you just take that out, then the costs of operating your building will be reduced so much more that I always say good design is cheaper than bad design. It may not be on day 1, but by day 10, it definitely is.
Actually, we're done. Sorry for jumping in on Beth there.
That's okay, Kim. I forgive you. So we have a question here from Annie Grady, who says, this is a magnificent presentation. Again, thank you, Magda, it was really great. Annie says, I'm part of a team that is currently designing a health/cultural/well-being accessible space. Intersectionality is crucial for me to design. Can you recommend some good resources I can direct the design team to?
Absolutely, Annie. Thank you very much for your kind words. I'm glad you found it useful, this presentation. I'm more than happy if Beth can share my contacts with the people that are in attendance. I'd be happy to set up a one-on-one conversation with you, Annie, about your needs. But the 2 resources that I can mention, 3 resources actually that I can mention quickly. One, the Autism Friendly University Design Guide, although it was designed with university campuses in mind specifically, we intentionally designed it in a way that was generalizable across different building types and also had concepts that could scale up or down to different uses. So there is information in the guide that I think a good designer will be able to navigate and apply to their own case. And I think the project type that you're describing is fascinating, cultural health and well-being together. It actually is the perfect intersection of the work that I do with mixed design, which is my New York-based think tank and design consultancy firm that I work with, that I presented our multi-sensory wayfinding strategy for. You can go to the Mixed Design website. We have articles and material there that talks about our multisensory wayfinding strategy, about work that we've done on Mixed Museum, about some healthcare spaces that we've worked on. And we look at design problems from mix, specifically from this intersectional perspective. So I lead the expertise on autism and neurodiversity. My colleague Hansel Baumann looks at deaf space. My colleague Joel Sanders looks at gender. And our colleague Erin Friedlander looks at healthcare and medical needs. So there is a lot of material that we have published and that is available on the website. The third resource that you can find at my website, at which I will also send to Beth to make sure that she shares with everyone, called autism.archi, is a recent issue of an Italian publication where we curated a collection of projects. Some of them are healthcare projects, some of them are museums, some of them are schools, some of them are residential, but it's a curation of projects that have touched on the aspects indexed in some way or form. And they show how, and they're not necessarily all projects that are designed for autistic users, but they take the autistic perspective as a platform through which to design for other groups and for other typologies. So there's a curation of about 9 or 10 projects in there that I think designers would find useful to translate ideas from to your own project. But again, I'm happy to set up a meeting and have a one-on-one conversation with you. If I can be supportive in any way, I'm glad to.
Great, thanks Magda, and I can certainly share those contacts around if you pass them on to me. So we've had a couple of comments and questions kind of relating to open plan offices, and you know, it seems to be a thing that's kind of, I suppose, it's very kind of on trend, I suppose, to do that now. So there's one question, is it possible, from Sue, is it possible to design open office plans that are truly autism friendly? And I might just kind of bundle that together with a comment from, I think, Fiona in the chat, who talks about it's very hard to avoid the fresh hell of hot desking, which is something that's becoming popular, I know, in the university environment as well, in some of the buildings. She says workplaces are not at all inclusive, even in this day and age. Have you had experience of persuading employers to think more laterally about making truly inclusive spaces? So maybe you could just say something around the whole open plan issue.
Certainly. I mean, I'm involved with international group of property managers and human resource planners that are very engaged with all sorts of corporations at all sorts of levels. They've got 90 offices all over the world. And one of the projects we're working on is rethinking the workplace environment's future. A lot of that is being triggered by COVID and post-COVID, but the neurodiversity angle is also becoming increasingly important, especially in the tech industry. I'm seeing an emerging interest in the tech world. I think to understand how we design a better environment for the open office, we have to understand the motivation behind the open office. And that motivation sometimes camouflages itself around a benefit to collaboration and creativity, but the reality is that it is a functional utility cost-saving solution, because when you build these open office plans, you can squeeze it's a result of the modern industrial age movement in architecture and design post-World War II to the office environment. So it's about how do you create factories of workers that are office workers. And it has carried over. There's been a lot of work looking at it and reassessing it. But for the neurodiverse community, it can be a nightmare. And one of the ways, and the hot desking question, I think the major problem from the neurodiverse lens to the hot desking question is there needs to be a level of behavioral conditioning that people get from their workplace environment. So when they enter their office, they are triggered to get into the task of performing their task. And when that fit is correct, so when a classroom is laid out perfectly and a student gets into their space and gets the behavioral input of, we're now going to work on reading, or we're now going to be working on puzzles, and they use the same station for the same activity every time, eventually they get on task so much faster because of that behavioral conditioning that prepares them the moment they get into that sensory environment. They know what's expected of them. And that's a very subconscious process, because we can tell someone you're going to work on puzzles or you're going to read, or we can tell an office worker you need to finish this report. But if you put them on a desk that it takes them half an hour to familiarize themselves to the environment and the system and the setup of the computer, they're not going to get on task quickly enough. So one of the things that I recommend to clients who are working on workplace environment is this philosophy of spectrum space. So create a spectrum of spaces, from the very controlled, very quiet, very individual, very focused space, not only for a user who is neurodiverse and gets overstimulated easily from a sensory environment, but also for a neurotypical individual who needs a space to focus on certain activities. Maybe they're working on data entry and they can't make a mistake or something, and they need that kind of level of focus and space that they can't get. If you just look at how many people in open office plans have noise canceling headphones on, personal noise canceling headphones on, that is an immediate evidence of how poorly the acoustic environment is working. So, but if you create this spectrum, so there would be very focused spaces, there would be semi-focused spaces, there would be spaces that would be a little bit more collaborative, and then there would be spaces that could be open, because there are people on the spectrum who need those open views, who need movement. They need to be able to get up and walk around and think through a problem or talk through a problem while they're getting that vestibular stimulation. So you need to create the whole spectrum of that opportunity. And by doing so, and a lot of it is about matching that to then how you operate office. So who are you seating where, for which activity? There has to be a match. A lot of times I tell clients, if you don't operate the building the way we designed it, it will fail no matter how well we design it. So there has to be that conversation about, this is how this design is intended to be operated. Does that align with how you operate your business? So if hot desking, understand why they want to do hot desking. Is it a financial decision? Is it a spatial efficiency decision? Is it an illusion of some sort of collaboration and freedom and flexibility that in reality doesn't exist? So have that conversation with your operators and see if there can be part that is hot desking for those reasons, but there can also be parts that are more fixed, and you need that whole gradient of opportunities, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thanks, Magda.
Could I ask a question now? Please accept that I'm asking this question from a good place, because it might sound a little bit challenging, and it's more of a political question than anything else. When I go out and I talk to employers, and I do it on a regular basis, we will talk about neurodivergence and neurodiversity. And we'd always say that accommodations that you put in for people that are neurodivergent would be universal. If what works for neurodivergent people works for everybody. By creating spaces that will be, if you could call it, awesome friendly, does not that then create us and them boundaries?
It depends on how you frame them and operate them, Ken, but I agree with you, yes. So you don't want to, in your attempt to accommodate someone's need, create more stigma. And this is something that's very common. So I have spoken to individuals who themselves are on the spectrum, who are clients and facility managers, that really resist the autism-friendly room or the autism-friendly office, because that labels someone and would reinforce exactly what you're saying, the us and them. What I propose in this instance is what I call reverse inclusion. So it's about flipping the narrative and saying, we are designing with this sensory perspective for everyone. And the secret agenda to us is that it happens to be accessible for autistic minds and experiences, but that is not explicit. It is about creating space that takes people's sensory needs into consideration at large. And part of the agenda that helps move that conversation is the mental health agenda. So post-COVID, so many of us going from isolation back into the work environment have suffered from so many mental health challenges. on university campus, at hospitals and hospital staff. I mean, I cannot think of a sector that has not been impacted in their mental health from the pandemic. And part of these sensory environmental design tools can also assist mental health. So it's about how you present it. But I agree with you, Ken, if you present it as this is the autism room, and that just reinforces stigma. But if you say we're doing a retrofit of our entire open office plan and we're going to give everyone the opportunity to access office spaces, and you can sign up for the type of office space you prefer and make it very democratic and open and remove those labels entirely, and maybe start thinking from an HR perspective, do people need, one of the problems is people need to disclose their autism to be eligible for the accommodation. And maybe we have to have a design conversation. Well, how about we make those accommodations, again, that idea of availability as opposed to inclusion. Let's make a menu of spaces available to everyone without labels, without disclosure, without stigma. And if you do that in a very free and open way, I can almost guarantee that everyone will stumble across a benefit. And then later, a year in, you say, you know what? You remember that office? That was actually designed using autism-friendly guidelines, and you're using it as someone who's neurotypical, and these are the benefits that you're getting out of it. So it becomes a conversation.
Okay, well, thanks, Dad. You can come design my next building.
Happily.
Well, actually, you know, and I know you mentioned that you have a colleague who is working on hospital design, but I feel we really need you in the area of hospital design, mental health, but also general and physical health, as many of our units, wards and facilities are not conducive necessarily to healing. And there is so much in Ireland today. There was some discussion in our parliament about over 75-year-olds waiting long periods of time in the emergency department. And of course, the acoustic and other overstimulation they would experience there, and discomfort, I think, is really, really heart-rending. So architecture, I feel, has a key role to play. You also mentioned about sustainability, and recently I was chatting with a quantity surveyor who was telling me about carbon costing and other forms of sustainability. And the key message is the upfront cost is one thing, but we need to look at the recurring costs over many years, but also those human costs, which we've discussed this evening. I'm afraid we're almost out of time. In fact, we may well be out of time, but I wish we could go on. But perhaps, Magda, there will be more opportunities to liaise, network, and hopefully present and hear about your work here in Ireland and elsewhere, hopefully across the globe. I guess we'll
be happy to. Yes. Can I just make one comment about the healthcare space?
Oh, yes.
The statistics on mortality rates and medical health of neurodiverse individuals are shocking. Individuals, they have a shorter lifespan. They present with more complicated medical conditions completely unrelated to their autism, for reasons of, part of it is the hospital environment and the anxiety that creates. Part of it relates to executive function and other social issues. But the fact that the way we're designing our hospitals is stopping individuals on the spectrum from getting the level and extent of care that they need, to the extent that they are dying younger and getting sicker, is unacceptable. And something really has to be done about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's so striking. You know, I don't even have an immediate comment except to say, certainly in mental health care and in mental health nursing, we need to do a lot more in terms of the model of care, but also certainly we need to look at the buildings and the spaces, because gender is another area actually in terms of inclusivity, where we can do a lot more in terms of our models, but also our physical spaces. So certainly I'd love to follow up on this. For now, we'll bring our session to a close. I'd like to again thank Dr. Magda Mostafa of the American Cairo University, Associate Professor of Design, and of course lead at leading autism design at Progressive Architects and author of Autism Aspects. So it's been really lovely listening to you and hearing you here this evening, Magda, and thank you again to all of our listeners, everybody watching, and of course Beth Kilkenny from the College of Health and Agricultural Sciences and Ken Kilbride from ADHD Ireland. It's been a pleasure. Next time, who do we have next time, Beth?
Next time we have Amanda Kirby. Oh. And Amanda Kirby is CEO of Do It Profiler, and she is an emeritus professor, and she's going to talk, I think, about dyspraxia and DCD. Brilliant,
brilliant, excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to that one already. Thankfully, it's not June. I'm on holidays. It's July, so we'll be able to make that one. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye-bye, Magda.